change here between the first and second night of Pesach. So first
that's
Seder's early, the second Seder's late.
right.
Oh, that's funny. Oh, wow.
Yeah, that is bizarre. Okay. Okay, so I think I'll start off. I want to give an intro. Some of you, of course, do know Shalom, and some don't. I just want to give a background about him. So Shalom, I have 4 children. Shalom is my youngest child, and he grew up in Rochester, New York, and he actually went to the yeshiva that's there. It's like a Chafetz Chaim branch, but then we sent him to New York. First of all, he spent 3 years learning in Eretz Yisrael. He was 2 years in Yeshiva Kerem B'Yavna, and then 1 year at Rav Ilson's yeshiva. It doesn't exist anymore, and it was actually housed in Mea Sharim, but it was a nice building that had been renovated. And then he came back and he got his, he had gone to Yeshiva College, and then he got a smicha from YU, from REITs. And then after that, so his first professional position was as the assistant rabbi at Lincoln Square Synagogue. He was there for 3 years. And after that, he got a position, and this led him into his current field. He got a position as educational director at She'erit Israel, which is the Spanish Portuguese synagogue in New York City. It's on Central Park West. Very beautiful building. It's actually, though, the 5th building of that congregation, but it is the oldest, She'erit Israel, the oldest synagogue in America, and founded by those Jews who first came, those 23 Jews, came to the U.S. They were coming from Recife, Brazil, Amsterdam first, Recife, Brazil, and then they made their way to New Amsterdam in the year 1654. So Shalom was there for 6 years, and he really got imbued, with the history of the Spanish Portuguese Jewry. And he then was taking he loves to travel, and he had a goal that he would visit Spanish Portuguese synagogues like all over the world. So he was in Europe and visiting Amsterdam, he was in France, he was been to Italy, but then on his way back going to the US, he decided, okay, he'll stop in London. And there he met with Rabbi Dweck, who was the head of the Spanish Portuguese Jewish community. And he went to visit the oldest synagogue in London, which is the Bevis Marks Synagogue. And Rabbi Dweck offered him the position of rabbi there. So Shalom, is this your 6th year already? 5th, 6 years? I forget how long he's been in London. And right?
6.
And he started off with his PhD program in the field of Jewish history, specializing specifically with Spanish Portuguese Jewry. He'll explain to you why many of those communities were actually founded by Portuguese Jews. He'll explain to you how they got there, and then from there to the rest of the world. They are called Western Sephardim to differentiate them from Eastern Sephardim, like those of North Africa or those from the former Ottoman Empire and other regions of the Middle East. Let's see, anything else I should say? I don't know, Shalom, if you would like to add anything about your, so again, so he's going for a PhD, and he's actually going to be writing he's in the middle of writing it. His thesis will be about those original Portuguese Jews, and then, going in up until current times, who founded his congregation, Bevis Marks, which was founded, I think this is really interesting. So I told you She'erit Israel is the first congregation in America, those first Jews who came 1654. And this congregation where Shalom is presently, Bevis Marks, that's actually the name of a street. That's why it's called Bevis Marks. It has a real Hebrew name, but I don't remember it. And that was founded by Jews who officially then could live openly as Jews, starting under Cromwell's reign, and that's around the year 1655. So his shul as a congregation was founded in the year 1656, so literally 2 years after She'erit Israel in New York City. And the building in which his shul is located is over 300 years old. It dates back to 1701. Everything inside this shul is original. I mean, it's really gorgeous. It's like a weird feeling to sit there on those benches and just know, my God, for 300 years, people have been sitting on these benches, the same original aron and beam and the chandeliers and they're lit, with candles. It's truly, it's a very magical show. It's very spiritual to sit there and daven. All right, Shalom, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Does he hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, you're there. Okay. So if you want to add anything about your biographical background, please feel free. Otherwise, you're on.
That's great. Thank you, Mom.
Are you there?
So nice to be with all of you today, and especially to see some familiar faces. Two of my best friends from growing up, their moms are here too. So it's really nice to be with all of you and to keep connected over all of these years. My mother asked me to speak with all of you today about a topic that I've come to really love. It's an incredible, it's almost just like a story. Like it's hard to believe it's true. It's an absolutely amazing episode in the history of the Jewish people. And I think what made it so interesting to me was that it was like so amazing, and yet something that so many people don't know anything about, that it almost seemed like, how is that possible? And so that feeling of kind of rediscovering this really important story made me, really kind of immerse myself in this history, which is not part of history. It's still very much alive even today. So I'm just going to ask if everyone could just mute themselves, because I'm getting feedback. If you wouldn't mind, everyone. Sorry. Thanks very much. Ask if everyone could just getting feedback. Great. I'm going to ask my mother to mute herself as well, because I'm just getting it. I think because there's a bit of a lag in the time.
How long have you wanted to say that?
Yeah. So, Mom, can you mute yours as well, please?
How do I do that?
It's great. Okay. Hopefully it'll work now. Great. Okay.
I don't.
So, great. Good. So basically, I want to tell you this story because, as my mother kind of already said in her introductory remarks, the founding of all of kind of Jewish life in the West was as a result of these Portuguese Jews. And it's something that happened in the 17th century. And it's really what they began that ultimately allowed for development that all of us know. And I would imagine the majority, of your families, come to places like America, not in the 1600s, not in the 1700s, and if they made it in the 1800s, at the very end, if not into the 1900s. And so it's a story that's kind of almost we're not aware of, but that is in fact how it began. And so that's what makes it such an interesting story, because we're going to talk about what was going on in the 1400s. And what I'm hoping is that we'll be able to, in a sense, draw a line to the 21st century. And that's amazing to be able to kind of connect, 600 years where you can still, in a sense, touch it today from something that happened in Portugal, 600 years ago. So you were already studying about life in Spain and what was happening in Sfarad. I'm going to pull up one map here just to illustrate some of the things that they're going to be talking about. And what you have over here, this is a map of Spain in the medieval period. And you can see that there is no such thing as Spain, right? There are different countries in the Iberian Peninsula, right? The largest of them were the Kingdom of Castile, right? Which is why some places the language of Spain is called Castilian, really, right? And then you also have the Kingdom of Aragon, right, where they speak Catalonian, which is a different language even till today. And it was in 14, right? It was in this time period, right, that these two kingdoms would come together, right, through the marriage of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, and it would become this united kingdom, right? And then together, they end up conquering the southern portion of the peninsula, Granada, which had been under Muslim control since they conquered the peninsula in, centuries and centuries earlier. And so it was really the culmination of the Reconquista, right? The reconquering of Spain from Muslim hands that took centuries in order to happen. Now, we'll get to 1492 in a moment, but really to understand the events of 1492, it really starts in 1391. I know some of you were at the last class, but just very briefly, what ends up happening in 1391 is there is a uprising in Spain against the Jewish community. There is a growing religious fanaticism. It's something which has spread throughout Western Europe. England expelled its Jews in 1290, France in 1394, right? So there's a lot of kind of intolerance against Jewish people in Western Europe at that time. And there starts being an uprising that actually begins in the south of Spain, in the city of Seville. And there begins this riot against the Jewish community, and it ends up spreading from there north all through the rest of Spain. And what ends up happening is some Jews are murdered, right? Some Jews are, in order to save their lives, adopt Christianity, and some remain Jews, okay? So what you end up having after 1391 is this reality in Spain that there's really two groups of Jews, right? There's people who are living openly as Jews, and you also have this community of converted Jews, right? Become known as conversos. And both of those communities, in a sense, are living side by side. They may be even related to one another, right? It could be your sibling, it could be your cousin, it could be your uncle, right? And they're living in the same neighborhoods, right? So, but once you've converted to Christianity, it is illegal to now go and be a Jew, okay? So they're basically trapped living that way. And so already starting in 1391, you'll start having some Jews leaving Spain and going to North Africa, okay? And so that's kind of the beginning of the growth of Spanish Jews. There's already communities that predate this in North Africa, but you'll start having some people who will go to North Africa so that they can return to living as open Jews. That doesn't happen with everyone. And you end up having, throughout the 1400s in Spain, two of these different communities. Now, those who have converted essentially now have free reign, right? Now that they're Christians, they have no limitations. They can go into any profession, they can go to any school, they can do whatever they want. And so you end up having this situation where a lot of these conversos start getting ahead in society, right? And the Christians don't like that very much, because all of a sudden, they wanted the Jews to be Christians, but all of a sudden they now have competition. And so what ends up happening in the middle of the 1400s, there is a series of laws that are passed, beginning actually in Toledo, in the middle of the country, called Limpeza de Sangre, which are these blood laws that essentially distinguish between those who are, old Christians and those who are new Christians, right? And if you are from a converted Jewish family, you can't do everything you want. There's still limitations. So you end up having this like really complicated kind of social reality where you have, Christians who are from old Christian families, you have Christians who are converted Jews, and you have Jews. Now, during all of this, as you might expect, there are accusations. First of all, some people don't like these converted Jews because they now can take your job. And some of them don't like them because they say they're still Jews. They're still practicing Judaism. They can't do it openly. But you know what? When they go over to their brother's house and it happens to be Passover, they're having Seder, right? Or when they're buying their meat, they're buying meat at their local butcher that happens to be a kosher butcher, right? And so there's this sense that these conversos are maybe not sincere Catholics, surprise, right? And that in fact, they are continuing to observe Judaism. And so there ends up being established in Spain something known as the Inquisition. Now, the Inquisition is founded by a unpleasant fellow named Torquemada, who gets a papal bull, essentially granting him the authority to establish an inquisition. Now, there have been inquisitions in the history of Christianity before, but what makes this one so significant is it gives Spain almost like independence within their inquisition. So ultimately, the Pope isn't even in charge of the Inquisition. It becomes something that the Spanish have control over. And it's what probably allows it to become so bad that it goes way beyond what even the Pope would ever do, right? And there's Jews who live in Italy in papal lands, meaning what happens in Spain is just like way above and beyond. And what they set up this inquisition that starts inquiring, what are these conversos doing behind closed doors? Are they good Catholics, or are they still secretly Jews? Now, if you read the histories of this time, there's like conflicting views. Some people say, this inquisition was, ultimately legitimate, meaning it's offensive, but from a Catholic perspective, these people had converted and they're still practicing Judaism. So from a Catholic perspective, like, they have every right to be inquiring whether they are living as Catholics as they should be, or are secretly practicing as Jews. There's another school of thought among historians that says this whole thing is a charade. All this was about taking the money from conversos, because essentially, if you're taken before the Inquisition's tribunal and you are found to be guilty, then they're able to take all of your property. And that ultimately, this was just about enriching the Inquisition. And this was not about sincere Catholicism and their commitment to a pure Spain. This was really just about taking Jewish money. So the truth of it is probably somewhere in between, or a mixture of all of those of those different views. But in any case, we have this Inquisition that starts in 1481. You jump 10 years later, and you get to 1492. Now, 1492 is obviously the famous event of the expulsion of the Jewish community, and it follows on the heels of the conquering of Granada, as I mentioned. If you've been down to that part of Spain, you've been to the Alhambra. I mean, it's absolutely magnificent, right? To go to Andalusia, go to that whole area, you see the beautiful synagogue in Cordoba. You've seen the beautiful synagogue in Toledo, right? These have been really special Jewish communities. And what the expulsion does is obviously expels the Jews who are living in Spain. But this is where you have to appreciate what the expulsion was maybe all about, because it was expelling the Jews. It was not expelling the conversos. Okay? So if you were a converso or a descendant of a converso, you were not expelled, right? The people that were expelled were the open Jews. And the rationale for the expulsion, right? This actually, if you read the Edict of Expulsion that was issued by Ferdinand Isabella, it states the reason that they're expelling the Jews isn't because they hate Jews. They're expelling Jews because they're accusing Jews of influencing the conversos, right? They say the only reason the conversos are not assimilating and becoming good, sincere Catholics are because their neighbors are still Jews, and their neighbors are still inviting them for Passover Seder, right? Because their neighbors are still inviting them, to, pray the prayers of Rosh Hashanah with them. And if only we can get rid of all the open Jews, then all our conversos will become good, sincere Christians. That's at least the argument they do for it. We know that the senior, shall we say, rabbi in Spain is Abravanel, very famous biblical commentator. He's also one of the chief advisors to the king. He pleads with King Ferdinand to rescind the edict. He, in fact, offers a huge sum of money to reverse the edict, and Ferdinand turns it down. And in Bravanel's writings, he blames it all on Queen Isabella from Aragon. He says she was the real anti-Semite here, and Ferdinand just went along to please her. It's hard to say, but we do know that there's a lot of, shall we say, religious ferment going on. There's a lot of tension as a result of the conversos. They've created a really difficult problem. You know, when one Jew converts to Christianity, you know, it's no big deal. But when you have thousands and thousands converting, all of a sudden it creates a lot of societal tensions, because you have people who are clearly from a different background, different cultural background, and all of a sudden, you know, it breaks down those barriers. So in any case, the expulsion goes forward, and all the Jews, as we know, are expelled from this now united Spain, right? From Castile and Aragon. But the conversos remain behind. Now, we have, the amazing thing is we actually have the records, a lot of the records of the Inquisition. And what you find in the records of the Inquisition is that essentially by the year 1515, there are no more cases against Catholics arguing that they're still practicing Judaism at home. What that essentially means is that fundamentally, in that sense, it ended up working, right? By getting rid of all the open Jews, all the conversos that remained behind just assimilated into the rest of Spain. There no longer was secret Jewish practice in basements, you know, people's homes in Spain, right? That whole kind of like romantic picture that we have of, you know, Jews secretly practicing Judaism essentially is extinguished as a result of the expulsion. All the conversos ultimately, you know, within a generation become you know, law-abiding Catholics. That's part one of the story. That's part one of the story. The story really gets interesting at this point. And this is where I want to move on to a second map with you. And so here you have a map that shows you the expulsion of Jews from Western Europe. And as I mentioned, Jews are expelled from England in 1290. They're expelled from France in the late 1300s, and then they're expelled from Spain in the late 1400s. By the time you get to 1500, Western Europe is Judenreich, right? Jews have been expelled essentially from everywhere. And now the only places where the Jews, there's Jews in Italy, and there's Jews in Central to Eastern Europe, but Western Europe is empty of Jews. Jews leave Spain and they go to lots of different places. And this is the part that I kind of want to focus on a little bit, is Jews leave and they go, as we know, to North Africa. A lot of them go to North Africa. Famously, they go to Italy and they end up in the Ottoman Empire, right? Famously, the Sultan, Suleiman the Great, welcomed Jews leaving Spain into the Ottoman Empire. He says, you don't want them? Great, I'll take them, right? And they helped build the Ottoman Empire into incredibly a successful empire that lasts, you know, for many centuries. But there's one other arrow on this map, and that's this little one over here, right? And that's showing that some of them go to Portugal. Now, there had been a Jewish community in Portugal for some time, probably especially after 1391. Some of them Jews have escaped into Portugal. In fact, the Bravanel's family had been from Spain, had lived in Portugal throughout the 1400s until Bravanel moved back to Spain in the late 1400s, only to then be expelled from there, and he eventually went to Italy. But most of the community, but some of the community goes to Portugal. Now, in terms of numbers, it's really difficult to know kind of how many people ended up going to which place, but it seems that a sizable portion of the population went to Portugal. Now, that makes a lot of sense, because you imagine getting to Portugal means you don't have to get onto a boat, where we know that many of the people who left Spain were attacked by pirates in the Mediterranean. They left Spain not knowing where they could go or whether there was a place that would be willing to accept them. And so it was, there's terrible stories about what happens to many of the people leaving Spain in 1492. In fact, we know some of them even go back to Spain and just convert because they can't find any place that will accept them. So it's not surprising that some of them go to Portugal. Portuguese, as different as it might sound sometimes to Spanish, is essentially the same language as Spanish, same, environment, it's similar weather patterns. It's, a lot of the activities, the business activities in Portugal are the same to in Spain. And so there's a lot of reasons that a lot of them decide, let's just go to Portugal. Okay. Sorry, just getting a little feedback from somebody. Okay.
So I haven't seen you all. Is okay?
Sorry, somebody's
Going along.
maybe that's
Why don't you mute him?
The end of April.
I don't have the power to mute
And where's
anyone,
that?
but if anyone has unmuted themselves,
Very
you could please
Very
remute.
Good.
I don't know how I'm gonna last. It's gonna be Mother's Day.
Mom, I'm not sure if you have the ability to mute people as the host.
Can somebody call me at work and ask
I
me
am
a
going
question?
to be going
If you
to just
do,
the first
just
few days
try.
to North Carolina, and I've been a couple of times during the year to
Hi.
myself.
How do you do it, Shalom? How do you mute everyone?
I'm not sure if you hover over their name, over their
Yeah,
picture.
but I can't see everyone, so it's my problem. But
All right,
Okay,
well, we'll
how
give it
do
a
I-
try. Let's try to continue and let's hope it goes okay.
okay.
Okay, so essentially, a lot of people actually go to Portugal, and in Portugal, they're able to live as Jews. There's no restrictions on Jews living in Portugal. And so they're able to live openly as Jews. Unfortunately, 4 years later, the King of Portugal, King John, decides that he has a great idea. He's going to marry his son to the daughter of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. I think her name's also Isabella. And they say, fine, we're very happy to do this, right? He has this image of one day Portugal and Spain will become one great empire. And but it's on condition that King Zhao gets rid of all of his Jews as well. And he says, okay. He says, okay. So in 1496, the King of Portugal issues his own edict of expulsion. The big difference is that the expulsion has a year. It goes into effect by 1497. But what he does is that over 1496, he systematically converts all of the Jews that are in Portugal. Okay? There are stories where he takes people's children away from them. And he says, if you want your children back, you have to convert to Christianity. Otherwise, we're giving your children to Christian families. At a certain point, they round up all the remaining Jews who are going to Lisbon to take a ship to leave. And he basically imprisons them and says, you're going to stay in this prison until you convert. And basically, by the time you get to the end of 1497, everybody has converted. According to tradition, the only people that remain is that there are 4 rabbis that didn't convert, 4 elderly rabbis. But besides for that, everybody ultimately converts in Portugal. Now, why he does this, historians believe, is because he essentially makes the calculation, right, that he needs the Jews. Jews play a really important function in society, right? Most of society are either the peasants or are the landed aristocracy. There is no robust commercial class. The commercial class of Spain and Portugal were the Jews. They were the traders, right? They were the merchants. And the problem is, if you get rid of your Jews, then who's going to play that important merchant role in society? And this is the beginning of mercantilism. It's, the way that societies function is through trade, and Jews play a really important role. Now, the reason this wasn't a problem in Spain was because they had already converted Jews 100 years earlier. So even those conversos in Spain throughout the 1400s continued to remain in Jewish fields. So they could, in a sense, get away with getting rid of their open Jews because they had conversos who could still be their merchants. The problem is Portugal, if they got rid of all their Jews, they would have only had peasants and landed aristocracy left. There would have been no merchants. So in a sense, he needed his Jews to remain. He just needed to make sure that none of them were open Jews. So what he ends up doing is converting all of them. Now, what ends up happening, and this is clear from history, is it's in Portugal that you end up having, right, to use a poor term, but it's the way it's been known for a lot of time, right, the Marranos, right, this romantic, vision of these secret Jews that are, living outwardly as Catholics, but are living privately as Jewish people in secret, lighting Shabbat candles in their basement, doing whatever they can, to maintain some kind of Jewish identity despite all the odds. And that's really a Portuguese phenomenon. So the question is why Portugal, right? Why does it happen in Portugal when it didn't happen in Spain? And in fact, it remains in Portugal for centuries. We have records in my community in London of people arriving in the 1700s from Portugal, coming to London and starting to live openly as Jews. So you have people that have been living as Catholics, secret Jews in Portugal for nearly 3 centuries, right? And so why does it remain in Portugal while it didn't remain in Spain? And there's a work that was published several decades ago, which by a professor, Yosef Yerushalmi, and he says the following. He says there's several things that are different between Portugal and Spain. And these are the following. He says, first of all, in Spain, for a long time, you had this reality of open Jews living next to conversos. These conversos were able to rely on the open Jews, right? If they needed kosher food, if they wanted to have a Pesach Seder, they didn't need to, in a sense, do it themselves. They just went over to their neighbor's house and they were able to kind of be Jews in that way. All of a sudden, all the open Jews leave. And so in a sense, the conversos in Spain didn't know how to be secret Jews without the benefit of open Jews living next door. That's one side of it. Furthermore, you end up having this situation where in Spain, they've established an Inquisition, right? The Inquisition is looking into what you're doing at home. It's very dangerous. If you're caught by the Inquisition, at best, you have your property taken if you admit to wrongdoing and they say, okay, you get a second chance. And if you deny the charges and they don't believe your denial, they'll put you to death. So a lot of them say, forget that, right? It's not worth it. It's too dangerous. But in Portugal, there's no Inquisition. There's no Inquisition in Portugal. Essentially, the King of Portugal is telling the Jews, I don't care what you do in private. I just need you to be on the books Catholics. And so what you end up having is this firmly established double identity in Portugal that becomes established. Now, the son of King João, he will establish an Inquisition in the 1530s. And there ultimately will be a Portuguese Inquisition, but historians basically say that it had already become so firmly established in the Portuguese community to practice your Judaism in secret that even once they established an Inquisition, in a sense, it's too late. It's already become embedded in their identity. So much so that the Inquisition in Portugal is far worse than it is in Spain. It has much more devastating effects. The famous cases of putting people to death happens a lot more in Portugal, and probably for good reason, because there was probably a lot more secret Judaism happening in Portugal than there in fact was in Spain. And the third reason to say that there was secret Judaism in Portugal is the big difference between Spain and Portugal is the following. In Spain, as we said, the open Jews, they left. They left. In Portugal, no one had the option to leave. So in Portugal, it wasn't like the only people that converted were maybe those who were not as Jewishly committed, maybe those who, felt, it's not worth it, we'll just convert, what can we do? But everyone, so the rabbis, the teachers, the shochtim, the entire community had to convert. So you tell me, who's going to be more committed to preserving their Judaism in secret? Just some random Jewish person who was converted, or someone who used to be a rabbi, right? Someone who used to be a teacher in a Jewish school. Those people are going to say, you may have converted us, but we are going to maintain our Judaism in secret, even if we have to. So for all these reasons, you end up having a robust secret Judaism in Portugal. And the part that I'll say is the final thing is I mentioned in Spain, you have these blood laws. Those laws are deeply enforced in Portugal. There is very clear distinctions in Portugal between new Christians and old Christians. In fact, it's so ingrained that new Christians and old Christians don't even live in the same neighborhoods. Entirely new neighborhoods are built in Lisbon that are or in Porto in the north that are where the new Christians live. So essentially the new Christians are all living amongst themselves, right? In fact, they've found that sometimes in the basements of some of their homes, you can find doors that lead to the next one. So they don't have to go to other people's houses by going out their front door. They can actually, through their basements, end up gathering together with people from their neighboring buildings to have minyanim or whatever they would have gathered together in order to do. And on top of that, they essentially are all in the same professions. So they very much fit, not just the same religious background, but socioeconomically, they're all middle class. So they end up trading with each other. They live in the same neighborhoods. And you guessed it, they marry their daughters and sons to each other as well, right? Which historians call endogamy. So you have basically this reality that new Christians are only marrying new Christians. They do all their business with other new Christians, and they live in the same neighborhood as other new Christians. And so you end up having this incredible reality in Portugal of this Marrano Judaism, right? Of this secret Judaism. Now, ultimately, how Jewish were they? Probably depends who you ask. It depends maybe what generation. Obviously the first generation would have been very, you get 3 generations later without any formal Jewish education. How much, were they observing? How much did they know? It probably gets more and more limited. I would say the big thing is, though, they're never allowed to forget. They're never allowed to forget that they are Jews because they are new Christians. They know what their background is, right? They still marry amongst each other. So even if they're not living, shall we say, full Jewish lives, their Jewish identity is preserved. In fact, over the centuries in Portugal afterwards, at times there are people in Portugal who say, we should banish the Inquisition. We should get rid of all of these blood laws because, if we do that, they're not going to go practice being Jews. They're just going to assimilate. And who knows, they may have been right. But because they have all these restrictions, that's never a possibility. And so the Inquisition in Portugal goes on for centuries because there, in fact, are always conversos for them to hunt. Now, what will end up happening, and this is where the story goes back to Portugal, is I mentioned this marriage that happens in 1497. So eventually, Spain and Portugal do unite in 1580. And essentially, Spain takes over Portugal. And from 1580 on, anyone living in Portugal can move to Spain. So a lot of the conversos in Portugal relocate to Spain. They go to Seville, they go to places where there are other trade opportunities. And what you end up having is that from 1580 on, then the Spanish Inquisition starts accusing people of secret Judaism again. So you end up having kind of a return of secret Judaism to Spain after 1580. And that goes till 1640, when Portugal basically revolts. They no longer want to be under Spanish rule, and they separate once again. Now, the thing that happens is the conversos end up spreading, because some of them say, you know what, living in Spain and Portugal is just too hot. If we can go to maybe some of their colonies, then maybe in those places we'll be in enough of a distance that we can do what we want in private. No one's going to bother us. And so you have a lot of conversos that go to the New World, and they go to Brazil, they go to Lima, they go to Mexico, right? They go to places under Spanish and Portuguese rule where they think that, it's easier to lie low. Unfortunately, the Inquisition follows them. There ends up being an Inquisition established in Mexico City. There's a Inquisition tribunal that's established in Cartagena in Colombia. There's one in Lima in Peru. So essentially, they're not able to escape, but it kind of follows them wherever they go. So what essentially happens is, technically, they're not allowed to leave Portugal. It's one of the laws. But over time, some of them find ways to escape. And so you'll have, at different moments in history, maybe at times where laws are relaxed or where things are changing, they will go to different places, okay? And that's what I want to kind of show you on this next map over here. Okay, the map I want you to look at is a little bit the black lines over here. So as you can see, the red shows where some of the original people who leave go to: North Africa, to Italy, and so on. You start having some of them who have gone to Italy, and so you'll have communities established in Italy, kind of there'll already be Sephardic communities in Italy from the times of the expulsion. But from the late 1500s, you'll start having Portuguese communities in Italy, in places like Venice. So if you go to Venice, there are two synagogues, right? There's many synagogues in the ghetto. One of the synagogues is known as kind of the Ottoman synagogue, and one is known as the Spanish synagogue. The Spanish synagogue is really the Portuguese synagogue. That was made up of Portuguese Jews that went there. They go to places like Livorno, right, to Leghorn, and they establish a Portuguese community there. But things start to get more interesting when you get to this part over here, because what you end up having is that around 1600, some of them make their way to Amsterdam, okay? And in Amsterdam, which is a Protestant country, they are free to return to Judaism, because Protestants don't care that they had been Catholics. They've also stopped being Catholics. And so when somebody stops being Catholic and returns to being Jews, it doesn't really bother them. And so you end up having in Amsterdam a rapidly growing community of former Portuguese conversos who return to Judaism. And you start having these Portuguese communities start popping up all over the place. You have one in Hamburg. There's an important one. You end up having ones in southern France. The ones in southern France are a bit complicated because that's still Catholic, but it's not Spanish. So there's like more tolerance for these bad Catholics, secret Jews, and so forth. And so you end up having them in places like Bayonne and in Bordeaux, where you end up having Portuguese communities. And then in the mid 1600s, they start coming to London as well. And you have a Portuguese community which is established in London in the 1650s. And like they did when they were part of Spain and Portugal, many of them also go to the New World, and they go and settle in Dutch colonies in the New World and in British colonies in the New World. And so you end up having Portuguese communities that are established all across the Eastern Seaboard in British America, right? In New York, in Newport, Rhode Island, in Philadelphia, in Savannah, in Charleston, and all these places they established Portuguese communities. In the Caribbean, they established communities. There's Portuguese communities in Suriname, which is in South America. You have in Curacao, in Barbados, in Jamaica, in St. Thomas. And so you end up having kind of all these places that are part of this kind of Atlantic world, right? Both sides of the Atlantic, which have high amounts of trade, they're living there. Why are they there? Because remember, in Portugal, they were merchants. And so they essentially go to the Dutch, they go to the British, and they are able to continue on as merchants using their trading connections, and they establish trading centers all along the Atlantic basin, again, on both sides of the Atlantic, and do huge amounts of trade among these places, and really create this network. They become known as the Portuguese nation, right? When you have Portuguese traders outside of Portugal, it's code word for Jews, right? And it's in these places that they reestablish Jewish communities. And these are the founding Jewish communities in the West. They return Judaism to Western Europe, and then they return they establish Judaism in the Americas as well. And obviously you go into the 1800s when you start having immigration of Central European Jews, and then late 1800s, Eastern European Jews that will then follow in their wake and will obviously ultimately far surpass them numerically and end up establishing, obviously, the Jewish community that we know today. But the amazing thing is those original communities didn't disappear. They're still there. So if you come to New York, you can go to Sherith Israel, the Spanish Portuguese synagogue in New York, and it's still there. It's still functioning. You just often don't hear these communities because they're one synagogue among thousands. But those original communities are still established. I'll just show you. I'll show you a picture of my synagogue here in London, just to give you a sense of how beautiful they are. And so this is the Bevis Mark Synagogue in London. This is a view towards the front of the synagogue. If you were to come to the synagogue right now, you would see you wouldn't see any of this. It's all scaffolded. We're right now doing a restoration project, and we're also building a visitor center. So the whole synagogue has been scaffolded as they repaint and fix things around, make sure there's no damp getting inside. But in another 2 years, please God, you'll come. You'll see the whole thing in all of its glory again. But they built phenomenally beautiful synagogues with incredibly rich traditions. And if you go to one of these Portuguese synagogues, it's literally walking into like a different world. You're walking into a different time. There's a sense in these synagogues, things are done differently. There's a different tempo. The melodies are different. The traditions, even the way the synagogues are kind of set up, are different. You'll notice there's no parochet on the aron. So even some of the Jewish traditions are quite different as well. And they create these communities that, as I mentioned, these communities still exist until today, and are just really special places. I could talk about these communities and the history for days. You can see I'm quite passionate about it. I think it's just a remarkable story and something special. And I always tell people, when you think of these communities today, these are the oldest Jewish communities in the world. Almost every Jewish community in the world has been uprooted in the past century. You think of Europe, you think of the Jewish communities in North Africa, in the Middle East, none of them are there anymore, right? Or at least, had times where they didn't function due to the Holocaust. The oldest synagogue in the world today is Bevis Marks in London. It's operated without any interruption for over 3 centuries. And so it's this amazing thing that these Western, shall we say, new congregations are actually today the best link we have to that earlier time, to kind of like the pre-modern era. Almost every other Jewish community in the world is new from the past 100 years, from the past 150 years, whether in America, or in Israel today. So when you get to go to one of these Spanish and Portuguese synagogues, it's like an opportunity, whether you're Sephardic or not, to like touch a part of the Jewish story that predates all the upheavals of the 20th century. And you feel it. It's something really special. So, I didn't grow up in one of these communities, as my father will tell you, who's on this call as well. But I feel this sense of responsibility to ensure that these communities are preserved for the benefit, I think, of all Jewish people, because I think there's something important, as Jewish people living in the 21st century, to have places that we can go that connect us to that sense of Misorah, that sense of tradition that was so, so awfully, interrupted during the 20th century. And so I feel like this is a value. I always tell people, I say, every person once in their life needs to spend a Shabbat at Bevis Marks. Every Jew. It's a phenomenal experience, and that's my invitation to you to come spend Shabbat with us. There's lots of hotels. We're right in the middle of London. We're a 10-minute walk from the Tower of London, so it's a good area, and you'll come for meals. And it's hard to convey it in words, but if you come and you hear the prayers and you hear the choir, and you'll know what I'm talking about when you experience it. So I think I'm going to stop here. I imagine people may have some questions, and I'm happy to take them.
I have a question.
Yes.
The Inquisition in Spain, I think, was finally ended like in the 1960s or 70s or something. Was it ever?
The 1830s officially.
I think when the king came back to power in the 70s or something. Well, okay, so that's fine. Did it ever end in Portugal? Was it ever officially ended in Portugal?
So yeah, in both countries, it was abolished in the 1800s. In Portugal, I think it's around 1810, and in Spain around 1830. That was part of the secularization that's happening across the world in the 1800s, where eventually the people themselves, the non-Jews in those countries, were like, we don't want an Inquisition anymore. Because the Inquisition didn't ultimately only root out Jews. It looked for witchcraft. It tried to see, what were people reading? So they would do book burnings. And so it ended up being a real, shall we say, brain drain. It really limited kind of intellectual honesty and the pursuit of science and things like that. So eventually those countries themselves abolished it. And a lot of these places, they got rid of evidence of the Inquisition. So in some places they burnt the records, they destroyed the different kind of like palaces of the Inquisition as well. Some places things still remain, some places the Christians themselves got rid of them because they had enough of them. But in fact, at Bevis Marks, even nowadays, at Kol Nidre, on Yom Kippur, we still recite a prayer for the people who are suffering at the hands of the Inquisition. And so obviously they were doing that for the first 200 years of the synagogue, or first 150 years of the synagogue, praying for relatives of theirs who were still in Portugal, suffering from the Inquisition. And I don't know, even after the Inquisition ended, they just kept saying it anyway. So we still say it.
Okay.
Rabbi, just a quick question. You said eventually they moved to Holland. When they now, with kashrut, waiting from milchiks to fleischiks, in Holland they have 1 hour. Did that go anywhere back to the Spanish idea? Where did that come from?
Yeah, that's a great question, because the idea of actually, Rambam says 6 hours. It's actually the Ashkenazi Rishonim that were far more lenient about how long you needed to wait between meat and milk. So it's unclear exactly. It may have been more the Ashkenazi community in the Netherlands that promoted it, though I think the Sephardim, I think, also only waited 1 hour. So I think that's it's a good question. But in Germany also, the Jews there only waited 3 hours. So obviously that part of the world, the Jews had a bit of a different tradition about how long the break needs to be between meat and milk.
Yes, shalom.
By the way, I just want to mention that my wife is a Batson, and her brother was from Rochester, and I'm sure you knew Jerry and Bunny Batson.
Absolutely. Good, we got the Rochester connection going.
Right.
Great, thank you. Hi, Raina.
Hi, I was wondering if there are remnants of the Jewish community that can still be seen in Portugal.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So the answer is kind of. I mean, there's Jewish communities now in Spain and Portugal, that were established after the 1830s. The community in Portugal was not as old as it was in Spain, so you don't have the same extent of remains. They have discovered some remnants of old synagogues in Portugal. There's a town called Tomar where they found a synagogue, and they found some evidence of hidden Jewish practice as well. Things where they can tell where they had maybe had a secret synagogue, or maybe where the mezuzot used to be hidden behind doorposts and things like that. So it's more like you need to know where to look to see it. It's not as evident as it is in Spain. But you can go to the places where the Inquisition happened in Portugal. So there's elements of different aspects of the Jewish story that are there that they've tried to at this point kind of mark. But sometimes the marking is more where things happened, not because they actually have the thing there anymore. They're starting to do now these Jewish heritage tours of Portugal too. So you can go there and you need a guide who knows where to kind of take you basically.
I was in Barcelona a couple of years ago, and where there was a big debate there years ago. I don't remember, was the Ramban with a priest? I forgot the actual debate, but outside that building, there was a wall that the Spanish took tombstones from the cemetery, and they had to build up that wall. And you can still see the Hebrew lettering on that wall from the tombstones.
Wow.
That was part of the wall. I forgot exactly where it was. Maybe you
Thank
can.
you. Yeah, there's some wonderful remains in Spain that you can see nowadays. Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions?
Rabbi Morris, any thoughts on stories about Columbus and those who traveled with him coming to America, in terms of there being conversos or anything like that?
As far as I understand, there's no evidence. I think there's some evidence that his navigator may have been a converso descendant. Again, not someone who was necessarily, not everyone who was a descendant of the converted were secret Jews. Some of them just became Catholics. So, that we don't necessarily know. We think his navigator was probably a descendant. There's no evidence that Columbus was. It's funny, if you look into the historiography in the late 1800s, Jewish historians tried to build up this idea that Columbus was maybe a descendant of conversos. They did it around the 400th anniversary, right, in 1892. By the time we got to 1992, and all this stuff about the way that Columbus, killed indigenous people and things like that, all the Jewish historians were like, no, he's not ours. So these things kind of go with time, but there's no evidence that he was. Just a nice confluence of events of 1492, I think.
Thank you, Shalom. This was great.
That was wonderful.
Like you said, a fascinating story and information that a lot of us don't know about. So this was great.
Thank
great.
you, Karen. Thank
Thank
you.
you very much.
So you guys should know there are places you can go in America even before you come to London. So obviously the Spanish Portuguese in New York is still functioning. The oldest remaining synagogue in America is in Newport, Rhode Island, which is lovely. That was built, I think, in the 1760s, and absolutely beautiful. Obviously, that was a Portuguese synagogue as well. They often call them nowadays Spanish and Portuguese synagogues because it became a bit more inclusive. We also include the Spanish, but that building is from the originals as well. So there's some really neat places you can visit in America too. And if you want to go to the best Portuguese synagogues, you go to the Caribbean. People always say, oh, it's amazing that you've gone visit all these places. They took me to Barbados and Curacao. It wasn't a very difficult thing to convince myself to do. Absolutely beautiful synagogues there with sand floors, and just a really special part of Jewish history. So if after lockdown you want to go enjoy the beach, I mean, you guys live in Florida, you don't need that, but
We do. Thank you. This was fabulous.
Mhm.
So informative. It was really great. It was great
you.
seeing you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Tim,
All
Thank
right,
you.
Mom,
Thank
you want to
Malka,
you want to
I'd like to recommend that you go to Charles. What? Oh, you don't hear me? Just